Good evening. I am Matteo Vaccaro-Incisa. I am Jean Monnet Senior Fellow at the Robert Schuman Center for Advanced Studies at the European University Institute of Florence, and I am venturing into making these videos from this temporary office in lockdown Italy at my place, following the kind requests of a few friends and colleagues, especially from abroad, with the view of offering a brief review of the economic impact that coronavirus is having on the Italian economy and the measures so far put in place by the Italian government. I will do so also by making reference to the measures put in place in countries such as France, Germany, and the UK. Well, then on to the first part. I wish to make three brief preliminary points here. The first is that even without coronavirus, Italy's projected growth for 2020 was particularly weak. Italy was not expected to grow more than 1% anyway this year, which follows, and is the second point, 20 years where on a balance, Italy's growth has been basically zero. And in fact, and this is the third preliminary point, over the last trimester of 2019, Italy recorded again a negative growth. Against this not particularly brilliant background, coronavirus is of course bringing further stress on the Italian economy, and economic projections for Italy's growth for 2020 are currently being adjusted and updated almost on a daily basis, always in the negative, unfortunately. Right now they range anywhere between -3 to -9%, and some even start saying that this is an optimistic number. It's important to understand who's right. -3 or -9, of course, are very different numbers. I will attempt to do it here. I do not have a crystal ball, but I believe it is possible to proceed through a certain numbers of assumptions and simplifications, also to make this video relatively short, or to present the Italian economy and projections for 2020 through the following 3 points. The first is a simplification that the Italian economy is worth, as of today, $2.4 trillion in purchasing power parity. Why I'm choosing this number and in this currency as opposed to others, it is because 2.4 trillion is particularly easy to divide over 12 months. It is in fact possible to say that Italy's economy, as a matter of simplification, is worth roughly 200 billion a month. The second is an assumption, which is that coronavirus crisis management and severe impact on the Italian economy will last for 3 months. I really hope we're not going to get there, but well, let's just assume it for the time being as a matter of conservative estimate. And the third is another simplification, is understanding which are the sectors that are the most affected by the crisis and its management in the Italian economy. Well, here you have, of course, manufacturing, at least most of it is severely impacted. Manufacturing in Italy accounts for a tad less than 20% of the Italian economy. Then, of course, you have very severely impacted the sector of tourism, which accounts for 6% of the Italian economy. Of course, you need to add to this all the services that are connected or related. So I believe it is relatively realistic to assume that 1/3 of the Italian economy is severely affected by coronavirus. Now, if 1/3 of the Italian economy is affected for 3 months, this equates to a damage of 200 billion over 2.4 trillion, equates to an 8% recession, which is particularly severe, and it's all the more so in light of Italy's national debt, which already stands at 135% of the GDP. And in this case, a recession of 8% basically translates, as a matter of simplification, into 8 additional points of national debt, which would then rise to 143%, which in turn would raise plain issue of sustainability of the Italian debt in light of the demographic and economic projections already out there for years of Italy's up to 2050, and the fact that Italy's debt for over 1/3 is still held by foreign investors, which makes it vulnerable. And also the fact that Italy's debt in the last few years has not shown any sign of decreasing. Against this quite gloomy background, what is that the Italian government has done so far to cope with the current crisis? What follows is a technical analysis and not a political one on a macro level, of course. Well, the first thing to be stressed is that the hands of the Italian government are quite tied in light of the numbers that I just outlined, especially because while there are state funds to cope with all sorts of emergencies, the amount of resources that is possibly needed by the current emergencies, especially in light of its length and the extensiveness may by far exceed the resources available. This implies adding deficit, which implies to make extra debt. But this extra debt at some point has to pay back with interest. So the Italian government has adopted a decree, which for the purposes of the present video, we'll just assume it's like law, in which it made available 25 billion, which is a tad over 1% of the Italian GDP. The bulk of these resources is reserved to three areas. The first, of 10 billion, is for the strengthening of the temporary redundancy fund of the state in order to, of course, to ease the burdens for the employers and, of course, guarantee the jobs of employees. Then 5 billion are destined to the, what I call here, the loan repayment freeze, which covers, of course, loans and mortgages, in light of the fact that both private individuals and companies may find it more difficult these days to repay their borrowings. And 3 billions, a tad over 3 billions, are destined to the strengthening of the Italian NHS, the National Healthcare Service, in terms of both new recruitment and purchase of new equipment. The rest is a number of measures that are more or less related to the current crisis. In order to determine whether what has been done is good or bad, I think it's important to see also what the others have been doing. So what has been done in countries like France, Germany, or the UK to cope with the situation? Here's a brief review where it is possible to see that measures of a very great magnitude have been announced. So Germany has announced measure for over 550 billion, which exceeds the 10% of its 4 trillion GDP. And both the UK and France have announced measures of roughly 350 billion each, which is again around 10% of the respective GDPs. These, of course, are measures that are of a much higher magnitude than the Italian intervention so far. There are three aspects that need to be highlighted here. The first is that all these measures so far are announcements. They're not law. These announcements have the clear effect of calming both the people and the financial markets. The second aspect is that the focus of these measures, at least for the part that has been announced, has a particular focus on the enterprise as opposed to the private individuals. And the third aspect, and most significant on a macroeconomic level, is that France, Germany, and the UK simply can't afford this because, as you can see here, the debt-GDP ratio of these three countries allows for, well, let's just call it a protective spending spree to face this crisis, which is something that Italy cannot really afford. So, in conclusion, is it good or bad what the Italian government has done so far? Well, clearly measures that are worth approximately 1% of the Italian GDP pale in comparison to what the other countries have done or have announced so far. And in fact, the Italian government has announced, this time itself as well, the adoption of a new decree where it will put into the system another 25 billion of resources. The question is where these resources will be drawn from. Is it going to be additional debt? Because it's not going to look good in that case. Then, of course, the background consideration stays there. The others simply can't afford to adopt these measures, while Italy is in a more complicated position. The solution lies in the proper display of a new spirit of solidarity and true cooperation at this time, if only because if Italy ends legs up in the air now or 5 years from now, this is not good for anybody in the European Union. I will stop here. Thank you for watching this. I hope it was